everyone, my name's Nethmin Liyanage, and this is Adam Tomasi, and we're both writers for the Champion Briefs, and today we're going to be discussing the September-October Lincoln Douglas topic, which is resolve the members of the World Trade Organization ought to reduce intellectual property protections for medicines. Adam, let's start off with your general thoughts on the topic and how you think this will play out.
Awesome. Thank you, Nethmin. So I think that this topic is still very primed for values-based debating and philosophy debating in addition to policy arguments, even though a lot of people's first reaction to the topic was that this doesn't look like a traditional LD resolution. I honestly think that more of that reaction had to do with the fact that the resolution did not begin with the United States, which can certainly be unusual for a lot of debaters. But when it comes to the ethics of intellectual property protections for medicines, there's absolutely a lot of ground to cover. And briefly to talk about, some ideas for topicality, it's worth thinking about the potential counterplan ground that's available in terms of thinking how you construct a topical affirmative. So I personally am of the view that a topical affirmative could just be compulsory licenses, even though other people would say that's instead just a counterplan. And to define that for viewers that are unfamiliar, it's the idea that governments can essentially force vaccine manufacturers or pharmaceutical companies to share their licenses with generic manufacturers. And I think that that does reduce intellectual property protections, even though some people might say it's really an alternative to a waiver. So that's another thing too, that the big discussion in the topic lit now is about a TRIPS waiver. TRIPS referring to the agreement on intellectual property protections within the WTO. But whether that alone even qualifies for being topical, is another question, because the waiver is intended to be temporary. So is reduce a word that refers to a temporary or a permanent reduction in IP protections? That's another interesting debate, because if the affirmative can say it's just temporary, then that kind of makes it difficult for the neg to prove durable offense, even though there are plenty of people that say even a temporary waiver would be catastrophic. And then finally, a big topicality issue is going to be about member nations. And I definitely encourage people to just, even if you like reading country-specific AFs, people will read, T, states, or they'll read T, about generic bare plurals, and you're just like, I'm not about that. I'm going to read an app about a specific country every time I have an opportunity to do so. You should really just bite the bullet and defend the whole res this time, because realistically, the WTO has to make decisions by consensus. So you couldn't spec a country and roll with that, unless, and this is the last note I'll make for now, you were to have like a clarifying note after the resolution where you're like, the member nations of the WTO should agree to this. And then when each country determines how their domestic laws are going to change, because once the WTO agrees to something, each country that's a member has to decide, well, how does this relate to our own laws? Then you could say, and then the US should change its legislation on patents according to the following mechanisms. And then you could have like domestic oriented advantages and then also the big WTO stuff. But you wouldn't be able to just roll in with like, plan, China should reduce IP protections. I think that's a lot less topical than specifying a state on like previous topics.
Yeah, for sure. I think that those are all really good points. And I agree that having judged quite a few rounds on this topic now, I don't think that there are a ton of really good single country affirmatives or affirmatives that defend a subset of countries. However, I think that where debaters are getting creative is with the word medicines. I've seen a lot of reinterpretation of, well, what all the words in the topic mean, but especially medicines. I've seen affirmatives that talk about medicines in the context of, for example, indigenous people, and say that we should be reducing companies' ability to patent plants or resources that are key to certain indigenous cultures. So I think that debaters are going to creatively interpret the word medicines to create an affirmative that's a little bit more skewed in their favor. So I would make sure that you have topicality shells that specifically talk about the medicines that you're prepared to discuss on the negative. And I would also make sure that you have answers to some of the more common affirmatives that do reinterpret the word medications, like the indigeneity affirmative that I talked about. And then the other note that I have for topicality is the word reduce. So this is what makes this resolution super reminiscent of a policy resolution, because most policy resolutions say that the federal government ought to substantially enact something or substantially reduce something. However, in this case, we don't have the word substantially in the resolution, which means in theory, you could be entirely topical and defend a really, really, really minuscule, almost negligible reduction in IP protections. You probably wouldn't have a super great advantage scenario, but that is an affirmative that could be topical, that would have that would put the negative in a different position, in a difficult position in terms of linking stuff to the AF. So I would make sure that you've also cut some kind of theory shell that entails what acceptable reductions are. And obviously, since the resolution doesn't have the word substantial in it, I would focus on where the topic literature is going, i.e. what do experts in the topic literature say is a substantial reduction or removal of IP protections? What are the most common apps? And I would even consider having a case list for your topicality shell of just like, here are common topical apps that negatives can have case neg ground to, just so that you're not caught in a place where someone defends the absolute tiniest app you've ever seen and you're forced to read the most generic of generics, like a cap K and a reps disad or something. So I would just advise debaters to be prepared for kind of the different ways that people are going to creatively interpret the resolution. Yeah, Adam, do you want to talk about some affirmative ideas that you have on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there are kind of three different types of frameworks that you could read, and then I'm going to kind of narrow down into discussing, one or two different affirmatives. I think that the first type of framework would be consequentialist or utilitarian in nature. That's pretty standard, and I think that on a topic such as this, with a clear discussion of preventable suffering around the world and life-saving medicines, that this is definitely a topic that favors utilitarian analysis. And that's even true when you're neg and you're talking about innovation, or you're talking about the ramifications of the topic for US versus China's leadership and soft power. Then the second kind of framework is more of the cosmopolitan frameworks that are about global justice, human rights, basically the argument that the birth lottery means that we should not prioritize people that live in our own country when it comes to making decisions as member nations, because just because someone's born in a rich country or a poor country does not mean that their moral status changes at all. And therefore, we have an obligation to ensure vaccine access as much as we can all over the world. And then the third type of framework would be more deontological in nature. And I'm specifically thinking about Rawls's theory of justice, because these are the types of frameworks that are not utilitarian, because their goal is to prioritize equal basic liberties as an absolute side constraint on political activity. It's not something that you can abridge, for the sake of the some greater perceived good. But it's ultimately also a kind of framework that engages with the property rights debate on the negative well, because when you read an AC that's already engaged with this rights discussion, and the neg also does that, but just kind of asserts that property rights are primary, I think you can get a lot of mileage as an apt debater by agreeing with the premise that there are like certain fundamental rights, and that's the focus of the debate, but that property is secondary to like the right to health, for instance, which is like codified as a human right. So lots of very interesting ground to cover there.
Yeah, for sure. I agree that those affirmatives are going to be super popular with debaters, especially debaters who are used to more philosophical approaches to a topic. So before I start discussing the affirmatives that I think are going to be super popular, I do have a question for you, because I know that a lot of debaters are experienced in answering utilitarianism affirmatives or standard structural violence affirmatives that have consequentialist impacts. But how would you suggest that debaters approach case negging a more cosmopolitanism-oriented affirmative that talks about things like the lottery of birth or egalitarianism egalitarianism that debaters may not be super familiar with handling at a philosophical level?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think with a lot of cases that are based on structural violence or global justice or another framework that has like a very compelling basic premise, I think that the best strategy is actually having an NC that is not intended to be the primary 2NR option, but still something the affirmative has to answer, and then winning the debate with case turns. And especially having good neg contentions that can link turn the AF. Like, even if you're reading a property rights NC, you want your contentions to be engaged with the question of like whether the AF doesn't truly achieve its goals of access. Because I think that one of the weaknesses of these cases is that it doesn't have a threshold for how much is a sufficient effort at working towards global justice or equal access, where if the affirmative is able to say, well, we have these, cosmopolitan obligations to the rest of the world, and the affirmative would increase vaccine access in the global south by like 80 something percent. I'm just making up a ballpark number. And then they might say, well, the app's not perfect. It's not going to put a shot in everybody's arm. But it's like, does that even satisfy the framework? Like, is that enough? And then I think at the point where the AF has to accept the premise that like they don't have 100% solvency, I think it's a lot easier for the neg to whittle away at what the affirmative then has to claim, which is just that they like have a comparative advantage over the status quo, because your link turns would demonstrate that they like really truly don't. And whereas, deontology cases have this advantage of being like very much a binary, like is the side constraint violated? Yes or no? And that's all. Consequences aren't really considered. But something like a cosmopolitan case, it almost is very consequentialist in the way that the contentions work. It's just that it establishes like what our perspective should be when we think about the effects of our decisions on the rest of the world. And so link turns are so awesome in that scenario. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for the AF, because I think that there are a lot of really compelling like contention level arguments for the AF. And it's almost kind of like a win for the AF if you read a framework that essentially leads your opponent to realize that they have to debate you on the substance in order to have a compelling argument. Because at that point, it's like, you're ready to debate the topic. You don't have to deal with two layers. And that's another thing. Like, I did say that these frameworks are like similar to util in application, but not in the philosophical sense. So you can't answer a global justice framework in the same way you answer a util framework, because they just have different assumptions about the world, but you're getting to the same offense. So in a way, it might be more strategic to read like some cool cosmopolitan stuff. My final note I'll make is that there's this great Judith Butler essay in Time magazine recently, where she talks about how the pandemic has made very abundantly clear, if it wasn't already, that like all human beings are interdependent and have a shared future, because as the pandemic spreads in one country, that affects everybody else. This is also something we can see with climate change. So this changes the nature of our obligations.
Yeah, I think that those are all really great tips on how to answer more cosmopolitan-oriented frameworks. Of course, I love the strategy of just going for case turns in the 2NR, so hopefully we see a little bit more of that from debaters. Maybe even just case turns in the 1NC. We'll see. I can hope. Um, so the affirmatives that I'm going to talk about are affirmatives that I think have been popularized on the circuit, both things that are currently popular and things that I anticipate people shifting into as the topic progresses and develops. So first, I'll start with an affirmative that I think is pretty ever-present, both in traditional and circuit debates. So I think that this is a bit rare in that usually traditional debaters are the first to say, defend the whole topic, there's no reason to be specifying, hashtag this is not policy. But I think that even traditional debaters are choosing to focus the debate on this particular topic and making theory-esque arguments about how this is the most timely to talk about, or how this is what's most rooted in the topic literature. And that, of course, is the COVID vaccines affirmative. almost every team has prepared an affirmative that just says the WTO should support a temporary waiver on COVID-19 vaccines, specifically so that low and middle income countries can manufacture vaccines. And there's been a lot of discussion on whether, viral vector vaccines are better for manufacturing in low and middle income countries, or whether mRNA vaccines are better for that purpose. But regardless, I think that every team has a version of this affirmative. So I think that debaters should be prepared to debate this both on the traditional and progressive level, because obviously on the circuit, even though this isn't nearly the A strat or the most advisable thing to do, debaters could certainly spend some time prepping just like a generic critique that they could whip out against almost any specific affirmative that they aren't prepared to handle. Whereas in traditional debate, a parent judge isn't going to be, super convinced that you have some old link from a long time ago about how all USFG action is capitalist, and that means that we should all be Marxists. So when you're preparing to debate this affirmative, I would make sure that you have answers both traditionally and in a more progressive multi-off strategy kind of way. And I would recommend that debaters look into the nuances of this affirmative, because I think that this area of the topic is just going to be a lot more developed in terms of the research that debaters do than other areas of the topic. So whereas, a question of what type of vaccine is going to be manufactured in low and middle income countries might not be a question that's being asked of other affirmatives, I think it will be a question that's asked of the COVID-19 vaccines affirmative. So I would just make sure that debaters are prepared to handle that. And then the other affirmative that I wanted to talk about was a whole res cap affirmative. So given that this topic curtails the powers or reach of a major multinational organization, it's pretty safe to say that we can liken this topic to negative state action, in which a state would curtail their power or their spending or their exports or something like that. And in that sense, it means that there are a lot of very good soft left, racial justice, social justice type benefits to be drawn from the affirmation of this resolution. And as such, I'm already seeing a lot of teams who are reading just like a whole resolution cap affirmative that just defends that all medications should have their IP protection substantially reduced by the WTO, and the net benefit of that is decreasing capitalism or taking steps towards ending capitalism in the form of reducing or destroying the amount of profit that pharmaceutical companies can claim from life-saving medications. So I think that this is an affirmative that is going to be both easy to respond to and difficult to respond to. I think it'll be easy in that any topic decide you have is going to link to the affirmative insofar as the affirmative does defend the entirety of the resolution. But I also think that it's going to be difficult to answer, and that obviously cap affirmatives don't intend to win the debate by beating back the innovation dissent. They intend to win the debate by utilizing their cap framing and whatever extrapolations they can make off the plan text. So when debating these AFs, I would be a bit careful about taking them at face value as just, oh, this is another whole res AF with some kind of framework. And I would make sure that you are beating back a portion of the cap offense that they're claiming, because chances are by the end of the debate will spin into a question of is cap bad or not, as opposed to a debate of will the WTO taking this action produce capitalism in a substantial manner. So just make sure that you are handling yourself in this debate in a way that allows you to garner offense against an affirmative that you might not be the most familiar with or prepared to answer.
Absolutely. And those are all fantastic points as well, especially with thinking about the different, types of affirmatives, especially with, framing that's, more critical in nature, like with the cap AF. I was curious about how different affirmatives have engaged with non-COVID related questions, even though I agree that some of the best affirmatives on this topic, given their most developed topic literature, will focus on the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that I've seen kind of a few different things. So I've seen affirmatives that are specific affirmatives, so they spec a specific type of medication that aren't about COVID, namely the HIV/AIDS affirmative, which in general talks about how IP protections for multiple different medications and treatments that are being utilized for HIV and AIDS research should not have intellectual property protections. So I think that there are medications outside of the COVID-19 vaccine that are being talked about, but I would say by and large, the way that people are handling this the way that people are handling non-COVID matters is they're reading them as disads on the negative. I'm not seeing a lot of affirmatives where someone's like, oh, we're here to talk about the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. That's what this AF is about. But I am seeing some disadvantages crop up that are just like, this specific thing should not have its IP protections reduced. So I think that non-COVID topics are appearing against whole res AFs in the form of like specific disads or PICs, planning inclusive counterplans. But I haven't seen a lot of affirmatives that talk about things other than the COVID vaccine, unless it's a whole resolution affirmative where the crux of the app, you can very clearly tell that COVID is the main focus of the app. But there are portions of the affirmative where it seems like they could pivot into garnering benefits from some other smaller medication if they needed to. But other than that, I think that the affirmatives have all been about COVID.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting to think about the very specific disads because that's often the neg's best counter against an AF that, because it's whole res, is able to claim a very large source of offense. Like if you're not just talking about COVID, but you're talking about like the full boat of medicines that are life-saving and should not have such strict IP protections, that the neg being able to narrow in the debate is equivalent to the strategic advantage that comes from reading a plan. It's just a difference of who is claiming like this very specific ground. I think one thing that the app should try to do in engaging with these is to, similar to keeping up with a case list in terms of your topicality arguments, keeping up with the specific disadvantages that come up is really useful, because having an angle on each of the disads that are viable. Like there may be certain medicines that, though important in the real world, just aren't going to support a disad in the sense of having really good link evidence, like sizable impacts, not necessarily extinction, but like something that people write cards about as being like very substantial, very catastrophic. And another interesting component too is the extent to which the AF and maybe the neg too, depending upon the angle of their argument, can make framing arguments about the impact that almost kind of like flip the utilitarian calculus, where from a util perspective, you want to focus on the greatest good for the greatest number, and therefore the diseases that and other medical issues that have like the largest reach and scope and magnitude and all the other debate words. So in that sense, like a utilitarian, if they had a limited amount of resources, would say, I could do the greatest good by putting all my eggs in one basket of expected utility. Like, am I going to fund research on the COVID vaccine, or am I going to fund it on, the MMR vaccine? Or even that calculus could lead to like a bias against like doing work on HIV and AIDS. Because someone could decide, well, it's an emergency right now, COVID's more important. But if you were to read an AF about other stuff besides COVID, you could definitely read cards that talk about how your impacts routinely face a bias within society at large, within the literature, where these impacts are de-emphasized and delegitimated. And even if, these are diseases or other medical issues that don't have as high of case counts as COVID, you can make a soft left type argument by saying that it is worth making this fundamental change to IP law for the sake of people that suffer from chronic diseases that like don't get as much airtime. And I think when you're neg, you just have to kind of like defend like a very strong version of util, maybe with a counter plan that solves some of the app arguments so that you're not entirely saying, I only care about what I think are the biggest problems. But, having, the argument that's just like, look, we can't ignore COVID. Like, yeah, the app may be right, but like if they make the COVID response worse, like that's clearly a reason to reject it. Is so what what the negative would say. So very interesting debate here with framing and impact calculus too, aside from philosophy.
Yes, for sure. I totally agree with that. And the last comment I want to make that is applicable to both AFs and NEGs before I hand it off to Adam to talk about his favorite NEG positions on the topic is the distinction between lifestyle and life-saving drugs. So lifestyle drugs are commonly defined or understood as medications that can help to improve the quality of life or certain experiences, but aren't necessarily life-saving. So you can think, for example, like Advil for acne medication. Those would be examples of things that are nice to have and improve certain aspects of life, but no one has ever really died without Advil. Whereas life-saving medications would be things like treatments for diseases that would be otherwise fatal, or you could make an argument for COVID-19 vaccines being a life-saving medication due to the fact that they are preventing disease with such a high with such a high serious illness rate. So I think that this is much more of a distinction that's relevant when reading the topic literature than when having debates. I don't think that too many people are going to be reading like T life-saving medication or T lifestyle medication. But I do think that it's important to understand just when you're reading the topic literature, why researchers are making those delineations, especially because a lot of funding and patent decisions do happen along the lines of lifestyle versus life-saving drugs. So that's the last comment I wanted to make regarding just things to be aware of when you're researching for the affirmative. But Adam, do you want to talk about some of your favorite or most popular negs on the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thought too about like T life saving, because I think that you raise an excellent point, is that for those who are listening and may be confused about like what a generic drug means or like what it means for a drug to be patented and be exclusively held by a certain company, if you think about like, going to a pharmacy and you see like a brand name aspirin like Advil, and then next to it you have like the drugstore's generic version of a painkiller. Like that is essentially, in terms of thinking about that difference, the crux of this issue, where you have large companies like Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson who have developed these vaccines and expect to make a lot of money off of them. And by reducing IP protections, you would allow manufacturers elsewhere to make the exact same thing, essentially, but without the brand name, without having to pay the inventor for producing the vaccine for people. So it is the equivalent in like an everyday scenario to deciding that the generic aspirin is just as useful in our lives than like the brand name. And there may be a reason sometimes why like the brand name is better than the generic, but when there's an urgent need for access to these drugs, like it's not necessarily worth prioritizing the novelty of these drugs or like what we think is the proper reward for them in like ordinary circumstances. So I thought that was an excellent point. So that got me thinking about like, a way to, let viewers know about, what generic drugs really are and how that relates. So yeah, neg stuff. This segues well into the innovation disadvantage, the crux of which is that you need strong IP protections in the form of patents in order to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to develop stuff like life-saving vaccines in the first place. I think that the weighing argument a lot of neg authors make, that like, oh, if you didn't have, these like exclusive monopoly rights attributed to like licenses that last for 20 years, under US law, where you invent something and then you have the exclusive right to bring it to market, and anyone else who uses it or makes it has to pay you for the right to be able to do that. But the idea though is that you make all the money from everywhere your product goes. But anyway, a lot of neg authors will make the argument that without that system, the drugs that the AF claims are important would not exist to begin with. I think that argument's a little contrived, because it's like the uniqueness problem is there of like so many millions of people are in poor and middle income countries that like cannot access those drugs, period. So it does seem like really illogical to be like, they may not be able to access these vaccines now, but at least the vaccines exist, right? So at that point, I think the neg needs to make a better argument along the lines of a counterplan and disad combo. And even if you read an NC like property rights, where you're simply saying, intellectual property is morally equivalent to physical property when we're thinking about medicines, and it should not be infringed by the state. You still want a counterplan on the side, because that way you're able to establish that like we could expand access while respecting certain status quo, institutions in terms of like patents, for instance. And then your argument that like patents are key to innovation is like, well, if we reduce the patents, then there are going to be a lot of future innovations down the road that we won't be able to capitalize on. So even if, it seems like the right time to just manufacture the generic versions of the vaccines, think of the precedent that we might be setting for other medicines down the road if the AF does this. And also, there's a counterplan that can increase vaccine access anyway. There are certain proposals to like just encourage companies with government support to cooperate with generics manufacturers, or like giving more money to the COVAX program to like donate vaccines to countries. I think the AF also needs to press against those arguments by indicating that like there's a clear timing issue. Like it's just going to take years for that to catch up with global demand. And so requiring that patent holders give up their monopoly and cooperate with generics manufacturers in low and middle income countries would accelerate production in a way that the counterplans can't really achieve. But I think as the neg, you can still go for this like best of both worlds kind of framing of like, you don't have to reduce the IP protections to do the important stuff that the AF says we need to do. And the AF would have this net harm of like undermining long-term innovation. So whether you're reading a deontological NC or not, I think you still want to be engaging with those practical questions of like, the AF is right that there is a problem in the world. How else do we fix it? Because otherwise you're left saying, don't touch those property rights. And the AF can say, but like people are dying. And maybe from a deontologist's perspective, it's like one doesn't entail, restricting the other in terms of like, can't restrict property rights even for the greater good. But the AF does make a compelling point about like what the greater good is. So
Yes, for sure. I totally agree with what you're saying about needing to have some kind of counterplan or counter advocacy along with your property rights NC or your innovation disads, so that you are making an implication beyond just these are someone else's property rights. And I think that an interesting way that a lot of debaters could go is advantage counterplans. So I feel that advantage counterplans, especially multi-plank advantage counterplans, are a bit of a lost art in that debaters tend to limit themselves to just like the 2 or 3 generic counterplans on the resolution. But I think that especially with affirmatives that are just pretty true coming out on this topic, like the affirmative about not encroaching on indigenous heritage sites, for example, I think that negatives are going to need to start to get creative, because at that point, the only viable strat you have against that affirmative is either T medicine or indigenous people don't matter. And that second one's not really an acceptable strategy in front of those judges. So I think at that point, debaters will start to get creative and look to other ways to solve the affirmative. And I think that advantage counterplans are one of the best ways. So just briefly for folks who aren't familiar with advantage counterplans, they are advantage counterplans are counterplans that suggest an action that's not the affirmative, generally one that doesn't link to some kind of disad or net benefit, that solves for the offense that the affirmative is claiming, but obviously doesn't do the action that the affirmative is doing. So for example, against like the indigenous conservation counterplan, against the indigenous conservation affirmative, a counterplan that could be enacted instead of the affirmative would be like, instead of changing the way that IP protections occur so that people can't patent things that are necessary to indigenous heritage. We could, for example, make a counterplan argument that would say that we should just turn all places that have plants that are unique to indigenous heritage into conservation areas, or into like privately owned land, for example. And those are ways that we could protect indigenous rights. So those are examples of advantage counterplans that can be read against the indigeneity affirmative. And I think that especially against other affirmatives, debaters might come to similar conclusions. For example, with the HIV and AIDS affirmative, there is a pretty decent advantage counterplan that talks about just redistributing the HIV and AIDS treatments that already exist, because there's a lot of good literature about how even though the African subcontinent was where a lot of the HIV and AIDS epidemic started, they were the last to receive sufficient medication to handle the problem, and that some regions still don't have a handle on the problem. So this could be an argument that's made against the HIV affirmative, for example. So I think that advantage counterplans are going to be a really strong strategy that debaters can utilize. And I think that it's always a good time to start cutting advantage counterplans, because you can use them anytime that the same advantage rolls around. For example, if you cut the ocean bubbles counterplan, you now have at least one neg strat against every affirmative that talks about climate change or global warming. So I would advise negatives to cut advantage counterplans, but specifically to cut advantage counterplans with a disad in mind. Obviously, you can't cut disad links without not knowing exactly what the affirmative is going to be. But I would make sure that you have some kind of disad or net benefit scenario that you can read with each advantage counterplan. Because if you just have a really, really good advantage counterplan that solves the AF, but then you have no net benefit to it other than just like, this seems marginally better than the AF, then you're going to end up breaking a lot of really good prep without actually having any objective or place to go with it. So that's the first position that I wanted to talk about. And then the second position that interested me on this topic was just kind of critiques in general, mainly because a lot of the critiques do flow affirmative, since the affirmative is negative state action, so to speak. Right. It's probably good for gender minorities. It's probably good for people of color. It's probably anti-capitalist to make sure that everyone has access to medications, especially COVID vaccines. So at the point that this app is good for, just about everyone except for the richest 10 people on the planet, you seem like you don't really have a place to go in terms of critical literature on negative. But one way that I've found people negating with the K is by reading critiques of the World Trade Organization, essentially making arguments for how the affirmative doesn't do enough. The WTO shouldn't exist as an entity, even if they're, say, allowing more access to the COVID-19 vaccine. Why do we live in a society in which people have to fight for access to the COVID-19 vaccine or similar life-saving medications? And so I think that criticisms of the WTO are going to be something that's really useful. And I've seen debaters frame this in the context of imperialism, i.e. WTO propping up imperialism and racial capitalism and other things. And I've also seen people who go straight for just criticisms of the WTO as the organization itself being racist or sexist or exclusionary in other manners. So I think that debaters can cut critiques of the WTO as just a good generic negative strategy, because obviously almost every affirmative on this topic that's even remotely topical is going to engage with the WTO in some way. So having analysis of why an affirmative that retains the WTO in its current form is bad will mean that you have an egg strat against the majority of topical affirmatives. So those are my thoughts on negative positions that I think are going to be both unique and pretty universally useful.
Absolutely. And I have a question in mind too regarding how the AF can deal with some of these advantage counterplans and critiques. But I wanted to note with the Ks of the WTO that there is an excellent comparison to make, whether you're thinking about like where the link is going to go or like how the alternative is going to work, with the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s, with the protests against a WTO meeting in Seattle, Washington. And I think a big theme out of that movement is the idea that where the people that manage free trade judged that there would be this like seamless integration of the world's economies and complete mobility, that this mobility and like freedom of travel and trade and access has only been freedom for the wealthiest people, multinational corporations, and not for like immigrants, not for people of color, not for people in the global South, who are regularly marginalized by like the terms of so-called free trade. So you could definitely say that like the WTO is at fault in the first place for the inequalities that it is now trying to rectify. And why is it that we are imagining that the institution is going to fix itself? Because, something like fiat, which is often thought about in debate, is not even about like us trying to use the WTO in a way that's like, pressuring them to be more progressive. Like that's often a mistake with like, cards that try to say, well, even if the WTO is bad now, like we, like the good people, should be like trying to steer them towards better ends. It's like, no, you're simply imagining that like the WTO figures out the right thing to do. And like the neg can say that's a bad way, to debate. But so I really like that you came up with that example. So I had a question for you now about, how the AF can deal with some of these advantage counterplans or critiques. Because I'm sure for some viewers, it might be daunting to deal with either.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with the critiques because I think that that's a little bit simpler of an answer in that any generic K answer stack file is probably going to work, right? All of your the government is good, state action is the best way to solve violence. The AF is a step in the right direction. The people of color want the app. All types of arguments that you would traditionally make against a critique are still pretty viable against criticism of the WTO. So that would be my first layer of response. And then second, I think that you should just cut one or two cards about how the WTO is already making steps in the right direction. So you're not necessarily fiating that the WTO somehow becomes a better group of people or entities, but instead you're saying that they're already taking initiatives to become more diverse or become more inclusive or whatever the case is. So I think that can protect you from the majority of the critiques. And then the last thing I would do is I would prepare some kind of theoretical objection. So I don't think that, like interpretation debaters may not read critiques is exactly viable strat anymore or really ever was. But I do think that other types of critique theory, like for example, vague alt's bad, could be pretty good because almost every alternative on a critique is pretty vague and doesn't really describe what they're going to do. So I think that you can almost always get a violation for vague alt's bad. So I would just prepare some kind of theoretical objection to the critique. And if all else fails, you can use your standard or roll of the ballot to frame them out. If you're super worried that your opponent is going to read a critique, you can always read an underview in your AC that just has like one or two cards about how state action is the best way to accomplish like revolutionary change or social justice oriented movements. And then regarding the advantage counterplans. So I think that advantage counterplans, when done well, can be pretty abusive. I think that honestly, the reason that so many debaters have survived their careers not experiencing advantage counterplans is simply because not enough people read advantage counterplans. But I think that there are a lot of debaters whose careers might end if advantage counterplans ever become super popular. That being said, I think that a theoretical objection is probably a must because there are just about infinite things that I could do to solve something as broad as like racist oppression. So I think that making sure that you have specific advantage counterplan bad theory and then multi-plan counterplan bad theory will mean that you at least have a 1AR shell to read in these scenarios. Beyond that, what I would do is I would do some reading into the specific mechanism of your AF. So the way in which your affirmative implements the resolution, when it happens, all that stuff. Because then you can likely do time frame weighing or magnitude weighing or strength of link weighing about how the unique method that your affirmative utilizes is better than whatever method that the negative is trying to utilize. Because chances are you're going to know more about the way your affirmative functions than the negative is going to know about whatever random thing they're going to pull out a few rounds a year. So I'd recommend doing comparative analysis. And then the last thing I'd recommend doing against advantage counterplans is diminishing the strength of the net benefit, right? If the negative is reading an advantage counterplan and then they have this huge disad that they're saying like turns case, if you win that the disad doesn't link to your affirmative or that the impact is super minimal, then even if the advantage counterplan still exists and is another idea that could occur, if there's no huge net benefit as to why the advantage counterplan is a good idea, then I would recommend that you beat back that net benefit as much as you can because it's really hard to win an advantage counterplan if it's not actually better than the affirmative. So those are my general thoughts on responding to those types of negative positions. I guess now we should move into letting debaters know what our final piece of advice are for them regarding this topic.
Perfect. So my biggest advice related to what you had said excellently about, how the affirmative can think about their mechanism. I think that is so important when thinking about how to beat not only advantage counterplans, but also with beating disads like the innovation argument. Because no matter what the negative says, you always have your affirmative to fall back on, meaning that even if you don't have specific cards about the MMR vaccine or whatever other really specific disad the affirmative has, it's still a subset of the innovation thesis. So if you have cards that just prove that IP protections in their present form do not spark medical innovation, the neg can't just say, well, my cards are more specific than yours, so I just win automatically, because they still have to engage with the warrants and they still have to prove that patents are key. Of course, there may be some really specific reason why patents are key to this particular medicine and generic answers to patents key to innovation don't quite address that. But that's up for the neg to figure out. And if your 1AR cards are, or even cards are extending from the AC, are sufficiently detailed, I think you'd be able to make a much larger claim that no matter what disease the neg wants to focus on, IP protections are not how you spur beneficial outcomes. And then in that field, and then with advantage counterplans, having more evidence to demonstrate why reducing IP protections is the one necessary thing that solves each of your impacts is, I think, in most cases, a sufficient enough block to read against a lot of advantage counterplans, just because even if the negatives cards prove that their alternative proposal does succeed to an extent, their cards, because advantage counterplans are meant to not necessarily be related to the topic literature, they're just related to here's another way that we can go about solving the problem you've identified, which is not limited to the topic. Their cards are not going to be saying the counterplan's better than the AF. So if you just stick to your guns and say, I swear the AF is like the one necessary thing we need to do first to solve this problem, then I think you're golden. And then I would also suggest with September, October, that you still do some deep, close reading. I know that the topic has a quick turnaround and you're going to have a lot of tournaments where you're rolling in with not a whole lot of prep. I know that usually there are some topics like Jan Feb where people get more tournament experience. The topic goes on for longer, so you'll feel more prepared. But even though it has that quick turnaround, still do your best to get to the foundations of the topic, because you would not want to be caught in a scenario where someone wins simply because you overthink the specificity of the arguments. Like, make the debate simple. Remember what you're doing when you're AF. When you're neg, remember the plan that you set out for yourself before the debate. And then finally, I would say do a lot of cross-applying with evidence, because this is a very hotly debated topic right now. And a lot of AF authors are responding to neg authors and vice versa. Not necessarily by name, but like every article has some section devoted to like, some people say that we're wrong because of this, but they're actually incorrect because blah, blah, blah. So you should be treating those as like a gold mine for being so well prepared on every real world angle of these debates, because the blocks are literally writing themselves.
Yes, I think that's all really, really good advice, especially that last part about the topic literature kind of answering itself. I think that my piece of advice is pretty similar. So first, I want to caution debaters, I guess, on thinking that they're familiar enough with the topic just because this is something that's already being discussed in the mainstream, right? Everyone's talking about COVID vaccines. Everyone's talking about booster shots. If you have family or friends in other countries, you're probably talking about vaccination rates there, which can lend a false sense of familiarity to the resolution, right? Everyone thinks that they're a doctor and a scientist and a virologist and everything else. So I would just make sure that you are actually doing the reading that's pertinent to this topic, right? Knowing that some countries are under vaccinated doesn't mean you know what TRIPS is or how the WTO functions or what a reduction on IP protections would actually mean. So just make sure that you are actually doing the reading to make sure that you know what's going on in the topic literature, because something like IP protections is really hard to just fake it till you make it. You do have to know a little bit about it to have a debate on it. So I would just make sure that you are doing the close reading to understand what the resolution is about at a fundamental level, and not just cutting the first 7 cards on Google, because unlike other topics, the first 7 articles on Google are actually probably going to be things that everyone doesn't know, whereas right now everyone knows what the first 7 things are on Google about COVID. So just make sure that you are doing close reading of the organizations and legal documents that are necessary to understand this resolution, and make sure that you are doing research and making sure that your authors don't contradict each other, because there is a lot of cross-pollination between authors right now, and you want to make sure that you haven't accidentally and unintentionally miscut something. Yeah, thank you to everyone who has watched this topic analysis and stuck with us as we ramble about the topic for 45 minutes. We wish all of you a really happy and fun start to your second COVID debate season, or maybe second and a half. Happy debating, and make sure that you cut some good cards.
Absolutely. Happy debating. Have fun. And this is such a great topic. It's amenable to every style of debate. And I wish I were debating this topic now. It's been a long time, but it's a good one. So good luck, everybody. And from Champion Briefs, signing off.